I destroyed my own company trying to prove a point. I hired dozens of women, gave them opportunities no one else would, built what I called a feminist fortress in an industry that didn't want us there. My name is Amanda, and 3 years ago, I launched an all-female logistics company to prove that women didn't need men to succeed in the toughest industries. Today, I want to tell you how ideology nearly killed my business, and how I learned that proving a point doesn't move freight. This is my confession. This is the story of how I discovered that reality doesn't care about your revolution. I was 34 when I decided to build something that would prove everyone wrong. 20 years of watching men dominate logistics, of sitting in boardrooms where they looked at me like I was lost, of hearing every excuse about why women couldn't handle the industry. Too emotional. Too soft. Too distracted. I'd heard it all. I started in warehouses, running night shifts, lifting boxes that weighed more than I did. I clawed my way up, and every step felt like pushing through concrete. Men who were half as qualified got promoted over me. Men who couldn't organize a calendar ran operations while I scheduled coffee runs. So I decided I wasn't just going to compete with them. I was going to make them obsolete. That's how I ended up launching my logistics company with one non-negotiable rule: all women staff, no exceptions. This was my chance to build the world I'd always dreamed of, where women got the opportunities men took for granted. I handpicked every woman on my team. Rachel, who'd been laughed out of 2 interview rooms because women supposedly can't handle 18-wheelers. Alicia, who knew every back road in the state but spent years making coffee runs at her last job. Marcy, the quiet one who'd worked warehouses for 5 years while men half her size got promoted over her. Training days were brutal. Certifications cost a fortune. But watching them line up in uniform on launch day felt like proof we were rewriting history. The investors loved the story. Contracts lined up. Articles called me the face of feminist logistics. Our office walls still smelled like fresh paint, but I told everyone we were building something the world would never forget. For the first 3 months, I felt unstoppable. Every morning I walked into that warehouse and saw my vision come to life: women running trucks, managing freight, proving that we didn't need men breathing down our necks. A few women even told me it was the first time they'd felt safe at a job. One hugged me, whispered that she finally felt valued. Moments like that reminded me why this was worth fighting for. I ignored the warning signs. A few late deliveries. A truck breakdown outside Dallas. Warehouse overtime costs running higher than projected. But that was normal, right? Every startup bleeds at the beginning. I told myself, and anyone who asked, that we were just streamlining. New company, new systems. We'd figure it out. 3 months in, I stood on stage at the Women in Business Expo under bright lights, telling hundreds of people how I'd built a logistics company run entirely by women. No men, no exceptions, and we were thriving. They cheered. Some actually stood up and clapped. I could see tears in a few eyes, like my company was proof their dreams could survive too. Afterwards, I worked the room, shaking hands, giving interviews. Then one reporter grinned and said something that made my blood boil: "You know, investors lined up because of the all-women angle, right? If this had been a regular logistics startup, nobody would have cared." I froze, smile glued to my face. Inside, I was screaming. I wanted to tell him that funding came because I earned it, because I built this from sweat and steel, not some PR gimmick. I just said next and moved on. That's when I saw Marcus. My former operations consultant, the one the investors had insisted I hire when we launched. He had 20 years in freight and warehouse operations. The kind of precision you can't fake. I'd kept him around just long enough to set up routes and schedules, then pushed him aside once my women were licensed. I hated that the investors still leaned on him in the background. It felt like they thought I needed a man as backup. Marcus was standing off to the side, no badge, no smile, just watching me work the crowd. When I finally walked over, he congratulated me calmly. His voice was steady, annoyingly grounded, the opposite of the champagne buzz in my chest. Then he lowered his voice and said it straight, logistics isn't forgiving. Deadlines, breakdowns, heavy loads. You'll need men for this sooner or later. It hit me like déjà vu. He'd warned me about this before launch. I forced a laugh. That's outdated thinking, Marcus. We're proving you wrong every day. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Just gave me this quiet look and said, I hope you're right. I walked away feeling victorious. But his words stuck with me like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. A week later, everything started falling apart. One of our biggest contracts, a retail chain distribution deal, canceled after 2 late deliveries. I told the team it was just a fluke, that we'd bounce back. But I started noticing small things. Rachel bickering over shifts. Alicia mixing up dispatch schedules. Marcy freezing up whenever deadlines stacked. One driver actually stormed out after being asked to cover a late run, shouting that she didn't sign up to be a workhorse. I laughed it off. Every startup has drama, right? Women just needed time to adjust to being in charge. But Marcus's words kept echoing. A week before launch, he'd pulled me aside and tapped the schedule binder. Hire one seasoned dispatcher, he'd said. Someone with 10 years under their belt. Even one veteran can stop the rookie mistakes. I'd laughed at him. Alicia knows maps better than anyone. We don't need some washed-up guy babysitting her. He'd just sighed and muttered, schedules break faster than trucks. I'd ignored him. But now his words haunted me. By midweek, the warning signs were piling up. 2 smaller clients delayed payments, citing service inconsistencies. One even hinted at pulling their contract unless we could guarantee on-time freight. Word must have gotten around because my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with investor calls. They wanted answers. Why our margins were bleeding. Why deadlines were slipping. Why clients were restless. Finally, they called an emergency meeting. Their voices were sharp, no applause, no friendly questions. Hire competent staff, including men behind the scenes, or we pull funding, they said. You have 2 weeks. I straightened in my chair, kept my voice steady. Men are toxic, unreliable. Not in my company. The words felt powerful in the moment, but part of me wondered if I sounded rehearsed. Marcus was there too, at the far end of the table, silent. He didn't push back this time, didn't even speak. Just shook his head, gathered his notes, and left the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. What kept me up wasn't the freight or the numbers. It was the thought of headlines. If we failed, it wouldn't just be my company going under. It would be proof that women couldn't handle the industry. I couldn't let that happen. The next morning, I called an all-hands meeting in the warehouse. I stood on a pallet by the loading dock like it was a stage, mic buzzing in my hand. My team looked drained, but I told myself they weren't tired, they were waiting for inspiration. I didn't mention investors or canceled contracts. That would only drag us down. Instead, I painted a picture of pioneers, of history being rewritten shift by shift. Every missed deadline was just a battle scar, proof that we were fighting harder than anyone else. They said women couldn't handle this industry, I told them. But we're proving them wrong every single day. Some of the women started nodding. One even wiped a tear like I'd given a TED talk. When the applause finally came, it echoed off the warehouse walls like thunder. In that moment, I felt unstoppable again. Like if we just believed hard enough, the numbers would fix themselves. For 48 hours, I believed the worst was behind us. Then everything exploded. Rachel refused a long haul to Denver. Said the overnight hours were unsafe for a woman alone. I tried to explain the contract required it, but she folded her arms. Men get killed at truck stops too. Why should I risk it? So I paid double to reroute freight with a third-party carrier. Told myself we'd rotate shifts more fairly, knowing the run would just land on someone else's plate. Then the gossip started. I caught 2 drivers whispering in the break room about Alicia ditching her run to meet a guy. The team that once felt like a sisterhood was fraying into camps: defenders, critics, complainers, loyalists. Everyone had a side, and none of them were mine. Alicia started showing up late, distracted. One morning, she double-booked 2 drivers on the same route. Our client called furious; their shipment was sitting in the wrong county. When I confronted her, she burst into tears, muttered something about being burned out. I told her she was strong, that men cry weakness but women cry resilience. Inside, I wondered how many more mistakes we could absorb before the investors noticed. Then there was Marcy. Steady, dependable Marcy. During a warehouse rush, she froze at the console, staring blankly at orders piling up. Forklift operators were waiting on her dispatch, but she just stood there whispering, "I can't. I can't." I had to step in and reroute everything myself. Marcus had warned me about this too. "Post every schedule where drivers can see it," he'd said. "Board, app, whatever. No secrets, no whispers, otherwise they'll invent favoritism." I'd waved him off. "We're not running some rigid boys' club. My women trust me." I believed that faith alone would hold everything together. I kept telling myself these were just individual hiccups. Men had meltdowns too, they just hid it behind bravado and cigars. At least my women were honest. Wasn't that healthier? The narrative always bent to fit my ideology, even as reality pulled the other way. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the floor erupted. One afternoon, I walked into the warehouse to find Rachel and Alicia screaming at each other by the loading dock. Rachel was accusing her of slacking off for some guy. Alicia fired back that at least she wasn't hiding behind excuses about safety. Forklift drivers actually stopped mid-shift to watch like it was free entertainment. I had to step between them before it got physical, my voice cracking as I shouted for order. Later that day, Marcy pulled me aside, whispering that Rachel had been badmouthing me too. Said I was too soft to run the place, that the investors would replace me with a man within a year. I laughed it off in front of her, but the words drilled into my skull all night. By the end of that week, the floor looked emptier every day. Rachel quit outright, tossing her keys on my desk. Alicia ghosted completely, one text saying she was done, then nothing. Marcy lasted the longest, but one morning she slipped her badge under my door with a note that just said, "I can't." The sisterhood I'd built, the one I swore was bulletproof, was crumbling in silence and slammed doors. The next morning, drivers were refusing to load, shouting over favoritism in shifts. By the time I stepped in, it looked less like a company and more like a family feud at Thanksgiving. I shouted about sisterhood, swore we wouldn't let male-style politics poison us. But deep down, I knew the truth. We didn't need men to divide us. We were doing it ourselves. That night, I sat in my office, lights off except for the glow of the monitor. That's when I heard the mop bucket squeak across the concrete. Luis, our night janitor, an older guy who wasn't even my employee, just an outsourced contractor I couldn't fire even if I wanted to, stopped and leaned on his mop handle. "Rough week," he said. I forced a laugh, told him every startup had bumps. He frowned and shook his head. "Lady, I don't get what you're fighting against. Guys like me don't want the spotlight. We just move freight, fix what's broke, keep the floor running." I stayed quiet, and he went on. "But freight, deadlines, engines, they don't care who's in charge. They just crush whoever can't carry it." Marcus's words flashed in my head again. Logistics isn't forgiving. I snapped back. Women can carry it better than men. Luis only shrugged, pushing his mop again. "Maybe. But proving a point won't move a load. Moving it does." I stood there, face burning. The way he said it, simple, unshakable, made my whole fight feel small. The next morning, I stared at the clock until the hands blurred. The investors had given us 1 week to turn it around, and this was the last one. I knew there was only one move left. The move I swore I'd never make. I drove to Marcus's office and sat in the car for 5 minutes, gripping the wheel like it was a weapon. Walking in felt like swallowing glass. He looked up from his desk, calm as ever, like he'd been waiting for this day. I forced the words out like a confession. The company's on fire. We're hemorrhaging clients, trucks sitting idle. I need you to run it. I hated how small my voice sounded. Marcus didn't gloat. Didn't smirk. He just nodded once, grabbed a notepad, and said, "Then we start now." The first day was brutal. He gutted schedules, reassigned runs, called in contractors he trusted, guys with 20 years on the road, mechanics who could fix rigs blindfolded, dispatchers who didn't flinch under pressure. I stayed quiet, watching him move through the chaos like he'd never left. By midweek, the floor felt different. Routes straightened out. Breakdowns fixed same day instead of lingering. Late shipments turned into early deliveries. Clients who'd been circling with threats started sending cautious thank yous. By Friday, even the investors had gone silent, which was the loudest relief of all. I walked the floor that night, engines humming like a heartbeat restored. The numbers were climbing back, the bleeding slowed, the fortress patched. But standing there, I knew the truth. The company wasn't running on my visi. A month later, the investors called me in for a closed-door meeting. No cameras, no reporters, just their flat voices cutting through the air. The turnaround worked, they said. The company's stable again. For a second, I almost smiled. Until the next words dropped like a hammer. Marcus is staying, with or without you. I blinked, forced myself to sit still. What do you mean? They didn't soften it. He runs operations now. You're valuable as a face, a story. But the company needs him. If you can't accept that, we'll move forward without you. My throat locked. I realized what they were really saying. I wasn't the boss anymore. I was the poster, good for headlines, powerless in the engine room. I wanted to scream, flip the table, tell them it was my vision that built this place. But all I managed was a nod, because walking out meant watching it all thrive without me. And I couldn't stomach that. Later that evening, after another interview where I smiled and said, "My vision saved this company," I caught Marcus backstage, clipboard in hand. I snapped before I could stop myself. "You heard that, right? I'm still the boss. This company survived because of me." He didn't even look up from his notes. Just said, steady as always, "Say it all you want. I don't care who gets the credit. I care that the freight moves." The words landed heavier than any investor threat. I wanted to scream at him, make him admit I was right, but he'd already walked away. Back to the trucks, like my outburst never even mattered. That night, I walked past the loading dock. Engines roared steady under his orders, the warehouse humming like a machine reborn. I stopped, watching the system I built run perfectly without me. The truth sank in, sharp as steel. The company was thriving, but not because of me. The next morning, I sat in my office drafting a new hiring policy. I didn't write "no women," that would sound cruel, petty. Instead, I wrote, "Line haul and critical ops demand veterans only. Minimum 10 years field experience. No exceptions." I told myself it wasn't because the women failed. I told myself it was mercy. Rachel shouldn't have to face Denver truck stops alone. Alicia shouldn't be breaking down in tears over dispatch boards. Marcy shouldn't be paralyzed by a console while forklifts wait. They didn't deserve work that brutal, that unforgiving. Better to keep women away from the front lines altogether. Leave the engines and deadlines to the men who can take the hit. But in the quiet between keystrokes, I knew the truth. I wasn't protecting them. I was admitting they couldn't carry it, and I couldn't bear to say it out loud. So I signed it, sealed it, and called it policy. I'm 37 now. The company is thriving under Marcus's leadership while I smile for cameras and give speeches about empowerment. I still get asked to speak at conferences, still get called a feminist pioneer. But every time I walk that warehouse floor and see the system running smoothly without me, I'm reminded of the lesson I learned the hard way: ideology doesn't move freight. Reality does. I wanted to prove that women didn't need men. Instead, I proved that everyone, regardless of gender, needs competence, experience, and the humility to admit when they're wrong. Maybe the revolution we need isn't about proving one gender obsolete. Maybe it's about recognizing that merit matters more than message, and that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong. That's what I'm learning. That's the truth I'm living with now. And if my story helps even one person choose reality over ideology, then maybe, just maybe, I can forgive myself for the damage I've done. Maybe redemption is possible, even for someone like me. What do you think? Have you ever let ideology override reality? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the messy reality of running a business.